Today, we're going to go through how to set up a 100% private generative AI with a modular, flexible architecture on your home gaming PC. Warning, we're going to get a bit technical, but don't worry, I'll hold your hand through the whole process. So, we're going to combine some open source virtualization technology, VirtualBox and Docker, with some open source AI technology, Ollama and OpenWebUI, to create this 100% private generative AI system on your gaming PC. While this isn't the simplest build out there, it is one that is accessible to all those who have the right kind of hardware. So, there are a lot easier ways to experiment with AI at home than what I'm about to present to you. So, why would I do it this way? Well, when I started down my journey of generative AI and experimenting with this about a year ago, like everybody else, I just didn't want to get left behind. But I'm also a cybersecurity expert, which makes me a bit paranoid by default. So I didn't really want to use chatgpt too much or any of those other public things like Claude or Anthropic. They are really good and really powerful. But if anything has taught us anything about, tech in the past, 5 years or a decade, is that big tech uses a lot of our data to make their big tech products. So I didn't really want any of my inputs to become part of that, especially if it's any of my knowledge. So private AI was really important to me. The other aspect, though, is that in a production setting, working in tech, if ever I wanted to use private AI in a risk-averse environment or a very privacy-focused environment, it would need to be 100% private. Also, the architecture would need to be something that's a little bit more portable and modular rather than something that is just a few applications. And that's because that's what really works when you set up production applications in a technology company. Using something kind of like segmented services, microservices, this kind of thing. So here's my personal requirements. Obviously, 100% private. I wanted to leverage the gaming hardware that I already had or minimally upgraded it. I didn't want to install a new operating system. I've got Windows. This is my gaming PC that's what it was at first. So I'm not really going to change that up. That has some implications. I wanted to build a modular stack that I could explore AI with. And I wanted that AI stack to turn on the system startup. That's kind of hard on a Windows desktop. I also wanted to access this remotely, which means I needed some extra security features, which also lends to the architecture. Now, these last two things we're not really going to discuss in this video because they're a little bit more complicated, but we are going to discuss the, I call proof of concept build, which sets up the foundation for being able to do those other things. So let's talk hardware requirements. As you can imagine, you need a relatively modern gaming PC to do this. But the components are very flexible, and you can run this on just about anything. Your performance might vary, of course. So, in my original build, I had, for motherboard, a Gigabyte X470 Aorus Ultra Gaming. It's kind of getting dated, but it works. I had an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X 8-core processor. I had 32 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 RAM, nothing special. An AMD Radeon 5700 XT, and about 50 to 60 gigabytes of free space, which you'll also need. Here's where I should quickly note that I found a problem with my 5700 XT, and it had nothing to do with the processing power or the capabilities of that GPU, and everything to do with drivers. So with all of this AI stuff, one of the limitations is that you do need to have vendor-supported drivers. For AMD, they only started making those drivers for the 6000 series and later. So my 5000 series card just wasn't going to cut it, even though it had enough processing power and enough VRAM, which is what's really important to this. So look, unless you have a 5000 series AMD card or earlier, then you should be fine. So any 6000 card or later will be fine. Of course, there are many NVIDIA cards that also support this. They're absolutely dominating the market when it comes to this, but I'm an AMD fanboy. So what I ended up doing personally is upgrading to a 7900 XTX, which was the best graphics card, AMD graphics card that I could get at the time. You do not need that much power, or you don't need that much GPU for a project like this at home. If you have a 6700, that's fine. You can probably do this on a 3080 Ti or whatever, right? Just, yeah.
So let's talk about those components. This build has a few more moving parts than your basic AI build. And that's because I constructed it to kind of fit my requirements and everything that I've previously talked about. You probably need to know, not know, but you'll need to use some PowerShell and you'll need to use some Bash. So we're using both Windows and Linux, but in slightly different environments. Don't worry, I'm going to hold your hand through the whole process. So even if you aren't technical, you should be able to follow along, and I will definitely leave some key commands and instructions in either the description or in the pinned comment. So let's talk the components. First, there's Ollama. Ollama offers a very extremely, or yeah, Ollama offers an extremely flexible and convenient platform on which to host large language models. When I started down this route, it was one of the few platforms that supported both Windows and AMD cards in beta. And now it's whatever, it's been supporting it for quite some time. It also provides an open AI like API. So ChatGPT, an API that's very similar to ChatGPT, which means that a lot of applications that can talk to ChatGPT can also be easily ported or are already ported to be able to talk to Ollama. So that makes it very, very flexible as a key component. The second component is OpenWebUI. That's basically an interface for the LLM. By default, Ollama gives you a command line interface to run and talk to the models. But, you know, let's be honest, we all like a web UI, something that's clean and easy to work with, allows us to drag and drop files and that kind of stuff. And OpenWebUI does that. It's the most like ChatGPT. It's pretty well polished. To be fair, I haven't actually used ChatGPT in a long time because I've been using my private AI. So maybe ChatGPT has changed, but this was a really good platform. Also, it has authentication built in, and there's constantly new features being added to it. Next, supporting some of this, we're going to use VirtualBox, which I mentioned before. That's a virtualization technology, so it's some software that allows you to run VMs on your hardware, whether that's a server or a desktop. It's very portable, free, and easy to install. On top of that, we're going to run a Linux distribution. I'm using Ubuntu, but you can use whatever you like. Obviously, the instructions will be a bit different if you use something other than Ubuntu. And on Ubuntu, we're going to be running Docker, which is what's going to host OpenWebUI.
It's at this point that I should remind you that there are other options to experiment with AI on your local gaming PC. One of the things I tried early on was LM Studio, and that was good. It again worked on Windows and AMD cards and allowed you to download lots of models from Hugging Face. It was good, but it didn't really, at least at the time, allow me to plug in different applications into it. So I couldn't really use it as like a server for LLMs. I can only really use it on its own. So it wasn't as flexible for my needs. Another option, which is maybe a little bit more a little bit easier for people, is anything LLM, which is another fat client. So it just runs on your Windows system. Um, but it does have an interface that's a lot easier to use, a lot more ChatGPT like kind of interface. I think it even allows you to host or installs with an option to host Ollama. So that might be a little bit easier for other people and feel a little bit user friendly. Again, I didn't know how flexible that was for me plugging in other things. And by the time I found out about anything LLM, I was already using Ollama on its own. But those are two options to explore. And who knows, maybe we'll make some videos about that.
So let's get into this basic build. First, we're going to install Ollama, and then we're going to install VirtualBox and set up the VM as our front end, and then we're going to install OpenWebUI Docker onto that. I know that sounds a little bit complicated. Like I said, I'll hold your hand. So let's go to my desktop now. Okay, Ollama is available to download at ollama.com. Just download it here, download for Windows or whatever your operating system is. Ubuntu is also available to download. Just go to ubuntu.com, products, server. You can download Ubuntu server here. And of course, VirtualBox is available to download at virtualbox.org. Click download, and then you can do that. Now for time and efficiency, I've already downloaded all of these. So I'm just going to bring that folder up for us here. And we're going to set up Ollama. So to set it up, double click, click install. There's no real options here. So it'll install in its default kind of directory, which is on your main drive. Great, it's installed. Now, most of the time when you just install Ollama, it will also start it up by default. And it will do a little icon like here. You see Ollama. Now, if you click on that, there's not really that many options. View logs, whatever, quit Ollama. That's because, like I said before, Ollama runs as a CLI. So we're going to open up a PowerShell window. And let's do this PowerShell. And we're just going to do Ollama PS. Boom. That tells me that Ollama is running. So the first thing we want to do with Ollama is pull an actual large language model. So for this test, we're going to do Ollama pull Gemma 2 9B. There are a lot of models available on Ollama, but I'm pulling this one because this is Google's Gemma 2 9 billion parameter model that has been quantized down to 5.4 gigabytes. So let's pull that. Now, while I'm doing this, if you just thought that, like, you thought what I said was like, what's he talking about? Quantization, blah, blah, blah. Listen, I didn't know anything about that stuff when I started either. And you don't really need to know what all of that means. The most important thing, though, is understanding model size. So with your GPU, you have a limited amount of VRAM. Most modern GPUs probably have somewhere between 10, 12, 16, whatever. Mine has 24, but that's a pretty big flagship GPU. You might not have that. What you want to do is find a model that is small enough to fit completely onto your GPU, hopefully within the 60 to 80% space of your VRAM. This model that we picked is 5.4 gigabytes, so it fits on a lot of GPUs. And the main reason for that is you don't want to offload any of the model running on your main hardware. So whether that's your main CPU or your main memory. The reason is that if it does, it will go much slower. The only exception to this is things like Max M1 Silicon, which have shared VRAM and actually work a lot quicker. Is it as quick as a flagship GPU? Probably not, but it'll be quicker than maybe your average gaming PC that doesn't have this kind of specialized hardware. So that's all that we're looking for when we're looking at these models. Oh, great. We are almost done. Okay. Now it's downloaded. Let's try it out with Ollama run Gemma 2 9B. And now it's loading it into the VRAM of my GPU, or loading it onto my GPU. Things are happening. And soon, voila. Let's ask it a question. That's a pretty weird question about hair follicles and unicorns, but let's see what it says. There we go. We've got some accidents. 100,000. Who would have thought? Anyways, so now we know it's working. Let's say bye-bye to that. And now what we need to do is set up Ollama so that it can accept connections from outside of itself. By default, Ollama only accepts connections on its local host. And since we're going to be running some virtualized machines elsewhere, we need to allow it to connect to Ollama. So we're going to run this little PowerShell command here, and we're going to need to run this in an admin PowerShell so that we can change the master environment variables. So let's close this down. And again, we'll open up PowerShell, but here we're going to select run as administrator. I'll put this command in the description or in the first pin thing, but we're going to do this. There's other ways of setting environment variables for your machine, but this is, I think, the quickest and easiest way. Now, if I set it like that, should be good. I will need to close it down because of the way PowerShell sets environment variables, and it doesn't set it for the session you're in when you're trying to set global ones. I'll open up a new PowerShell, and then I'm gonna check to see the environment variable exists. Okay, so get child env, that just gets all of the environment variables. Outstring turns it into a string like you would use in grep, and select string is kind of like grep, so it just allows me to search very easily for this. And there we go, Ollama host 0.0.0.0. Cool, now we're set up to go. Now I can quit Ollama, and then I'm just going to go and start it again. So for my start thing, I'm going to start typing Ollama and do that. Looks like it's back up, and now Ollama is ready and accepting connections. Okay, the next piece you'll need to use is VirtualBox. I've already had this installed on my machine, so I'm not going to reinstall it because that just takes too much time, but it's very easy to install. It's just a few clicks. We are going to set up the VM though, because that's the more interesting part. So here I'm going to add a new VM. I'm going to call this AI front because this is the AI front end. So Ollama is basically acting as my AI backend, the kind of like the smarts behind it. And I'm going to set up OpenWebUI as that front end. Okay, but I'm going to set this up on this server. So the ISO image, I'm going to select the image that I downloaded before. We're going to click next. I'm going to call it AI front end. Sorry, that was from a previous installation. So AI front end. You can ignore this username and password area because we're going to do an attended install. So we're going to create this. Again, ignore the host name. We don't really need to know that for now, at least for this basic part. Click next. Now, for memory, I suggest something like 4 gigs. My production one has 8. And for CPUs, I'm going to say 2 at least. Again, my production one has 3. But I think realistically, you probably don't need that much juice. I have more juice that I have on this PC than maybe necessary, and more than that minimum spec. So 4 gigs and 2 will be fine enough, especially as an early experiment. Hard disk size, I think on my production one I'm using like 100, but I've played around with that a lot. You probably don't need that to start with. So start with 35, maybe go for 40. That way you have a little bit more playing space if you want to experiment with a few things. So I'm going to leave that, I'm going to put that to 35, and we're going to click next and finish. Now it's going to start off the system, power up the VM. It's going to load that image, that Ubuntu image that we had downloaded already. Okay. And now I'm just going to install this. Loading, loading, loading. Okay. For the most part, we're just going to go with the defaults. I'm going to go continue without updating because I don't think I really need to update now. Default, Ubuntu server, you don't need the minimized version. Again, defaults here, no proxy address needed. Mirror address, I know that this is going to work, but it's worth you just making sure that this is tested because this will tell you that it can connect to the internet. Doesn't take very long anyways. Cool, it's done. Click done. Use entire disk. Click done. Now this is one of the few places that you got to change things. I don't know why the Ubuntu 24.04 does this, but by default, when you install it, it doesn't actually use up all the disk space that's available to it. If you remember, I said 35 gigs, and here it's using about half of that. So I'm just going to change that to 30.2966 to actually use up all the space that it has. Click save, and that's the only weird thing. That's one of 2 weird things you got to change. Click done, continue. Your name, well, I'm going to use Bob for this. It's not my name, but whatever. Your server's name, AI front end. Pick your username, Bob. Pick password. You're going to have to remember this because you will need this password to continue on. Done. Don't enable Ubuntu Pro, so leave it as skip for now. Continue. And this, you'll want to install OpenSSH server because it will save you a lot of hassle later on. Click done. We don't need any of these. So go to done and then watch it install. Now, this might take a few minutes on your PC, but let's fast forward all this. And we're done. Great. That took a little bit of time. Cool. Let's reboot. Great. Looks like it's up and running. Okay. We'll just test our login. Great. It worked. Now, we're going to modify this machine ever so slightly, and we're going to modify its networking. So we need to shut this down. We're going to do close, send the shutdown signal. And what we're going to do is we're going to change the network on this machine. As I said before, the reason we're doing this is we want this to communicate to the Ollama host machine. So the Ollama service that's running on the host machine. Right now, by default, when you create a virtual machine, let's bring this to center. Let's go here, click settings, and click network. It creates the adapter attached to NAT. So, however, for this, we're going to want to use bridge. There's probably some other ways to do this, but this is the easiest setup. And again, for the long-term setup, or for the way I actually have it set up in my production, I need this system to also be, this virtual system to be accessible from the internet. So I need it to act like it's right on the network, and that is what a bridged adapter does. So it makes the networking a little bit easier. So this name will be whatever your main card is. You might have a Wi-Fi card. I have a copper card as well. So bridged adapter, click OK, and then let's start it right back up. Let's close this because it's really annoying. Go away. Awesome. And now we're in. So let's log in again. Cool. Okay. There's a few things that we need from this machine before we move on to installing OpenWeb Docker and OpenWebUI. So first, we're going to need the IP address. And to find that out, we're going to do IP address show. Okay. And what we're looking for here is at the bottom in the number 2 area, and it says inet 192.168.50.143. That's the IP address for this machine on my network. Cool. Now that we got that, we can go and open SSH to this, which is why we installed OpenSSH before. Going back to our host machine, which is what this window represents, we're also going to need the IP address of the host machine, so my main desktop. And that's so that we can point OpenWebUI to this. So the easiest way to find that out, which I think presents the least amount of confusing information, so we're just going to do route print. And at the very top where it says network destination 0.0.0.0, look for interface. In this case, it's 192.168.50.10. And that's the IP address of this machine. So now I have that information, I can continue on. So first, let me open up. Actually, we'll use this same terminal. We're going to do SSH bob at 192.168.50.10. 168.50.143. I'm going to say yes to this, so that's the fingerprint, and I'm going to enter in the password. Great. Now we're running. Now we've connected to this virtual machine through SSH. And that is just going to make it a lot easier to copy paste some commands in, and we have a few commands to do it. Sorry. This is possible to do via VirtualBox on its own, but it involves installing a few things, and normally copy pasting by default is a little bit of a pain in the butt. So this is just an easier route. Okay, first, let's check that the virtual machine can actually connect to Ollama. So we're going to type in this command, which is nc-vz, and this is just checking the connection. 192.168.50.10, and Ollama's port, which is 11434 by default. And if you've been following this, you will not have changed that. Boom. Connection succeeded. Happy days. So we know that the virtual machine can connect to the Ollama host. Now, let's install Docker. First, we're going to do sudo apt update. And it's going to ask you for your password. Sudo, for those who don't know, is kind of like admin mode on Linux. But you still have to put in your username and password, so it allows some auditability. Okay, then we're going to do sudo apt install ca certificates curl. Great, that's already there. And now we're going to add the repository for Docker, the public repositories for Docker, which will allow us to install Docker on this. So that's these commands, sudo install blah blah. This, and then this. Great. And now we're going to add the finally add the repository. Sudo apt. Great. Now we should be able to get Docker, and we're going to run this command. Again, I'm going to list all of these in the description, or at least links to them. Great. Now we've got Docker installed. We can check that it's running. Sudo docker ps. Yeah, it's running, but there's no containers. Let's get OpenWebUI. First command we're going to do is sudo docker pull the OpenWebUI container. Now again, depending on your internet connection speed, this may or may not take some time. Great. So now we've pulled OpenWebUI. Now we got to get it running. So here's the command that we're going to use to get the Docker container running. Now, if you remember before, I said that you needed your IP address of your host machine, and this is where we need it. You need to make sure that this Ollama base URL is pointing that IP address. Again, if you left everything as default, you don't have to change 11434 because that's the default port. So this is, you need to make sure that this URL here, this IP address, is the one that we got before when we did the route print command. So let's run that. And it looks like it's done. Sudo docker ps, let's double check. And it's up and running. Great. So I think we're there. Let's go back and open up that window. And we're going to do a new window, HTTP 192.168.50. I think this is, what did we get before? 143. There you are, OpenWebUI. Click get started, enter your full name, Bobby No Mates. email address, Bob, doesn't really matter. But this is your admin credentials, so do keep that in mind. And then whatever you want as your password. Again, you'll just need to remember that. Boom, and here we go. OpenWebUI, and you see it lists the Ollama model that we have. You can also pull models from OpenWebUI into Ollama, but we're not going to cover that. There's other videos that talk about that. And here you have the chat space, so let's ask it a question. How many follicles this time the answer wasn't as interesting, or at least wasn't as specific. But anyways, we know it's working, and now it's working in a ChatGPT-like interface. So that was this video. This is my first YouTube video ever making. So if you liked this content, please like. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and put them down below. And until next time, I'm Troy Cunningham. I hope you enjoy your private AI at home.